join us. As Audrey pointed out, today is Shiva Asar B'Tammuz, the 17th day of Tammuz, which is one of the minor fast days. And but please feel free to eat. I'll share what I shared in the video message that's going to come out later today. You know, my thought on minor fast days like this is that I usually do a half-day fast. So I fast for I fast until lunch. So I feel like I've acknowledged the day, but at the same time I also acknowledge that our historical circumstances have changed. We're not in mourning for ancient Israel quite as much as we once were. So that's my feeling of minor fast. But that's not really the subject of today's Lunch and Learn. And I called the class today, How to Make a Rabbi. And it's going to have two parts. The first part is going to be some classic learning, so looking at the Talmud and learning about where rabbis came from traditionally. And the second part is I'm going to share some of my experiences, my inspirations that made me want to become a rabbi, want to move to Charlotte and meet you all. Yeah. So I'm going to put the question out to you to get started. Where do rabbis come from? And you can answer that question in any way that you want. Where do rabbis come from?
From Plainview, New York.
From Plainview, New York. Good answer. This rabbi does anyway.
Post-diaspora.
What was that?
Post-diaspora.
Okay, what do you mean by post-diaspora? You mean rabbis?
Destruction of the Second Temple.
Okay, so rabbis are a thing after the destruction of the Second Temple, and I'm going to guess that you would say, you know, they took the place of the priests after the temple was destroyed. They became the religious leaders. Is that what you were going for?
Yes.
That's the image that you have? Okay. All right, so we have Plainview. Yeah. You answered where one specific rabbi comes from. You answered, sorry, who was that who said post-diaspora?
Sarah.
Who said that? Okay, whoever
Sarah.
said something
very
Sarah.
I agree.
Got it. Said something very perceptive. All right, how else could you answer that question? Where do rabbis come from?
From their mother.
Yeah,
I thought it was the Jewish stork.
From their mother, the Jewish store. Where is the Jewish store? I want to know where that store is.
In your heart.
Stork. S-T-O-R-K.
Jewish stork. Sorry, I thought you said the Jewish stork. All right, the Jewish stork or the Jewish store.
And the Jewish stork flies from right to left.
Thank you, Cantor. Okay, so we have some humorous attempts. Good way to dodge answer the question. What was that?
Now you know what you're dealing with.
Okay, I like humor. All right.
Is it also just, you know, from within a community, there would be someone that was more learned or a scholar of some kind?
Okay, so I like that idea, Rochelle. I like that idea a lot. That a rabbi comes from a community. That you're a rabbi by virtue of your position in the community, and how you relate your relation to other people makes you the rabbi. Is that what you were going for?
Well, yeah, because any community of people looks to someone for leadership and answers to questions, and so it would be a sort of a natural community phenomenon to elect one person to invest in that person.
True, and
community.
Like it's fascinating what you say that when you think about there's some very small communities all over the country that don't have full-time rabbis or even part-time rabbis, and often there's one very knowledgeable person who just happens to take the lead, and the people look to that person as the rabbi. And it's really funny because when I was in rabbinical school, I was working at a small community called Temple Israel of Putnam Valley, not Temple Israel of Charlotte. And there was one person there that, he was the president, but he was also the unofficial rabbi because for most of the year they didn't have a rabbi there. And he was, the knowledgeable person who just volunteered to step forward and lead and speak. So they addressed him, they talked to him as rabbi. Now it's humorous because he was a very accomplished attorney. And I just, I was scrolling through Facebook yesterday, and I saw all of, you see a lot of people are doing minions services on Facebook. And all of a sudden I saw him leading a service, and I haven't seen him in years. and learned that he retired from his law practice and decided to make it official and go to rabbinical school. But that's two different possible definitions of a rabbi. It could be someone who is chosen by the community, who's, by virtue of having knowledge and leadership, is the rabbi, or it could be somebody who has a title. And it's interesting that none of you said anything about rabbinical school or rabbinical schools. Didi, what were you going to say?
When I had raised my hand, I wanted to say they come from JTS. They come from JTS. They come from the school out in LA.
AJU, the American Jewish University.
Some rabbis come from Seminario Rabbinico in Buenos Aires.
Yes.
But
You know your conservative movement geography.
don't they possibly come from Jewish experiences that excite? I took it a different way, that it excites a person to become a rabbi because of knowledge, yes, but also experiences, camp, Ramah, going a year in Israel, that motivates them to then go more deeply into the religion and think of becoming the rabbi versus it later in life becoming the rabbi because of experience.
So that's a great way to approach it, that maybe there's something that confers a title on the rabbi, but there's also the experiences, the influences that cause you to want to fill that role. I like that. So there are many ways. What's that?
You have to want to do it to be successful.
You do have to want to
grow into it, but there has to be a desire, I think.
It's true. Although I thought you said something else.
Drive.
An inner drive.
And not every rabbi is a pulpit rabbi.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at teacher, some of you went to rabbinical school and got master's degrees in education because you wanted to be teachers of Jewish education, and not pulpit rabbis. My son is the principal at, oh shoot.
Okay.
That's Warren checking on me. I'm sorry about that.
No problem.
My son is the principal of the high school at Donna Klein Jewish Academy in Boca. And all he's ever wanted to be is an educator.
Is your son Marshall?
You got it.
Got it. Okay. I think we overlapped in school just a little bit.
Yeah.
But I remember his name. So yeah, it's something that you have to want to do. He wanted to be an educator and went in that direction, and that's
there's just that intense drive that I still see in him, and I think it's important because for some of you, there's a lot involved in ego. But I see no ego in him. He really wants to be a teacher.
That's a good thing. Then it's good that he went in that direction, became an educator. Now it's interesting that you used the term drive. I remember when I was in rabbinical school, there was one assignment that asked rabbinical students to talk about was the rabbinate a calling for them. And I think that what a lot of people settled on was they didn't feel comfortable with the word calling. That felt very kind of non-Jewish to them for various different reasons. But I definitely fell into that category of you had a drive to do it, you wanted to do it, but calling was a term that we didn't relate to. So
I think also you have to. I don't know that pulpit rabbi and educational rabbi are mutually exclusive.
Oh, no.
Because I feel like there are a lot of rabbis that do both very well.
Oh, yes.
And granted, you can have the drive or desire to do one thing more than the other, which a lot of people have. Like, do you write better than you sing? Well, maybe, but you might want to do both.
Mm-hmm.
I think that a rabbi has to be very pastoral also. Know how to listen to what your congregants' needs are on a personal basis, on a congregational level. There are many facets to being a rabbi other than just the religiosity. And those are all the big words I can use at one time.
Well said, buddy.
Thank you.
Very,
Thank you.
very well said. So let's segue this discussion into into some of the classical texts about where rabbis come from initially. And this is going to be the more historical part of it. So I'm going to share my screen so you can take a look at my source sheet. When I teach, I like to teach off of texts. Hold on a second.
Yes, Elias, go ahead.
It's over there. Hold on. Windows. Where is it? All right, it's sitting there. Oh, there we go. Okay. Okay, can everyone see the screen?
Coming up.
Yes.
There it is.
Okay. So it's just a very nice coincidence that the origin of the idea of a rabbi or the idea of rabbinic leadership comes from the Torah portion that we read this Shabbat, Parshat Pinchas. Because Parshat Pinchas, we're approaching the end of the book of Numbers, and we're approaching the end of Moses' leadership of the people of Israel after 40 years in the desert. Now, Moses, when we look at him later on, he's given the title Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe, our translators, Moshe, Moses, our teacher. But Rabbeinu literally means our rabbi. Now, Moses didn't have ordination. He didn't have smicha from any seminary that we would recognize. But the way that later rabbis, later teachers perceive him is as one of them, as someone whose tradition they are following into. So Moses knows that his time as leadership is coming to an end. And he turns to God and he says, let the Lord, source of the breath of all flesh, appoint someone over the community. So he asks God for a successor, for someone to lead the community. What is this person going to do? Who shall go out before them and come in before them, and who shall take them out and bring them in, so that the Lord's community may not be like sheep that have no shepherd. So he's very concerned about this lack of leadership. He wants someone who's going to be designated by God. Now, Moses at this point might be hoping that his children are going to be appointed, his sons are going to be appointed as his successors. But that's not what happens, because God answers Moses, single out Joshua ben Nun, Yehoshua ben Nun, an inspired man, and lay your hand upon him. And laying your hand, to lay your hand in Hebrew, is the word is lismoch, v'samachta. And that's related to the word smicha, because traditionally when we talk about rabbinic ordination, it's called getting smicha or studying for smicha. Now, it's not the term that we use so often in conservative Judaism. We tend to talk about ordination, being ordained as a rabbi. But if you look at Orthodox rabbinical seminaries or Orthodox rabbis, they tend to talk about smicha more. Okay, so singles out Joshua, lays your hands upon him. Have him stand before Eleazar the priest, and before the whole community, and commission him in their sight. Invest him with some of your authority, so that the whole Israelite community may obey. But he shall present himself to Eleazar the priest, who shall on his behalf seek the decision of the Urim, the device that the priests use to consult with God. By such instructions, they shall go out, and by such instruction they shall come in, he and all the Israelites, the whole community. So Joshua is, let's use the term, Joshua is ordained as Moses' successor. But there are a few different parts to the ordination. So I'm going to unshare screen for a second. And actually, well, before I do, I'll just show you the picture. This depiction of the scene of Joshua being ordained. And you see Joshua is holding a sword in his hand, because Joshua was a warrior. And he's the man who's going to lead the conquest of the land of Israel. So we don't hold swords when we are ordained today, but that's the original ordination ceremony. Now in that, actually, you know what, I'll leave it on so you can see it. In that text that I just read, there are a few different components to ordaining Joshua. What are the different components that you see? Feel free to jump in.
Putting your hand on his, laying the hand. And
okay, so
having
there's a physical laying of the hands. Who's doing the physical laying of the hands?
Moses.
Moses.
Moshe.
So Moses. So what role is Moses playing here? What's his position?
He's transferring, he's physically transferring his authority to Joshua by laying his hand on him.
He's physically transferring the authority. He's the outgoing leader. He's standing up there, represents continuity. The idea that the last leader has faith in the new leader, that he can carry on his job. Okay, what else is there?
It's done in front of the entire.
Okay, someone said he goes before the entire congregation. What's the significance of that?
So they can see who the leader is, that it's been deemed official.
Okay, so on the one hand, it says
Transparency.
I like it, transparency. So they can see who Moses is appointed. They can see clearly that Moses is laying his hands on this man, and that he is going to that he's going to succeed Moses. But it also is another form of, it allows Joshua to see the community, to see the people that he is leading, that he is not taking this this job that doesn't have anything to do with the community. He's taking responsibility for all of those people. He's accepting the authority by virtue of them standing in front of him. They are accepting him as their own.
It's kind of like a unanimous vote.
He is standing before the priest.
Hold on, one sec, Margie.
It's like a unanimous vote of the congregation.
Okay, it's like a unanimous vote. We won't find out if they had to all raise their hands and say if they voted yay or nay, but it does seem to be unanimous. Okay, what else is there? Someone else was talking.
I said that he was standing before the priest, which to me would indicate this is the approval of God.
There we go. Okay, so he's standing before the priest. Now the priest could represent a few different things. The priest probably in his original context is representing the approval of God. So you have the approval of Moses, the outgoing leader, you have the approval of the people, the community, and you have the approval of God. Or, you know, if I wanted to put this into a more modern setting, God doesn't approve directly, but you have the approval of the tradition. Maybe you are a master of God's word, which is the tradition. So those are the three components that are in this initial smicha ceremony, this initial ordination ceremony. You need to demonstrate that the person, that there is somebody giving you the authority, a past leader giving you the authority. You have to be accepted by the community to lead, and you have to show or prove that you represent God, that you can hear from God, that ultimately you are subject to what God wants. So
Rabbi,
yes?
back then were the times that Joshua was more of a congregational community type leader and not a religious leader, or was the priest not necessarily the religious leader?
So that's
What's
a
the
really
separation there?
That's a very interesting question, because think about the first leaders are Moses and Aaron,
And they weren't religious people.
Well, but think specifically, Moses is the let's say the communal leader, and that he's leading them on their goal to get to Israel. He's the more like a civil leader actually, and it's Aaron who's the religious leader. Moses is specifically not. There's a separation of powers there. So isn't that and it looks like they're continuing that in the second generation, because Eleazar is the son of Aaron, so he's continuing the religious leadership. Joshua is continuing the civil leadership. But by the time we get to rabbis, the way we know them, those two things are not separate. For Moses and Aaron, and Aaron, and then Joshua and Eleazar, those are separate spheres. But rabbis in their earliest history were also civil leaders, not only religious leaders. I would say that today rabbis are civic leaders. necessarily civil leaders, but we don't have that type of authority. It's more of a religious leadership now, but the role of the rabbi has changed throughout Jewish history, and you pointed that out very nicely from this this initial text. So when later Jews, when later actual rabbis,
4 to 6.
by rabbis I mean post temple destruction, as someone said at the beginning, when rabbis really become the leaders, they want to cast themselves as the inheritors of the tradition of Moses. And the text that really lays this out is a text that probably a lot of us are familiar with, Pirkei Avot, the ethics of the fathers. And Pirkei Avot is a tractate, a masechet in the Mishnah, the law code that's compiled around the year 200 in the land of Israel. And Pirkei Avot, or Tractate of Avot, is the only tractate that's not legal in nature. It's ethical in nature. It has all of these pithy sayings that in which the rabbis are teaching you to lead a good life. But it begins with this chain of tradition. And it says, Moses received the Torah at Sinai. So it takes us all the way back to the Jews standing at the foot of Mount Sinai and the revelation of the Torah when we enter into the covenant with God, and we become God's chosen people, and we accept the Torah. We accept the responsibilities of the Torah. So Moses received the Torah at Sinai and transmitted it to Joshua. Well, we just read about that. So first of all, as we said just a second ago, Moses maybe was a civil leader, but here they're talking about him as a religious leader. What's he passing on? He's passing on God's teaching, Torah, to Joshua. So it wasn't only that he set him up to be the warrior leader, he also set him up to pass on God's word. Then Joshua passed it on to the elders, the Zikanim, and the elders passed it on to the prophets, to the Nevi'im. So the elders, the people who in Joshua's time, helped him lead, he taught to them. And they continued to carry out God's word as the Israelites settled in the land of Israel. The elders to the prophets. Well, we know that the prophets, whether they led the entire nation or whether they led just small sections of it, they were the next kind of chain of transmission. And the prophets to the men of the great assembly, in Hebrew, Anshei Knesset Hagadol, and Hagadolah. And we don't know exactly who they are. They're mentioned a number of times in rabbinic literature, but there's some type of very early rabbis. So when the rabbis are introducing Pirkei Avot, they're asserting that what we are teaching, our faith, our practices, can be traced all the way back to Moses and are passed down by virtue of it being handed to Joshua, then the elders, and then the prophets, and this unbroken chain that continues. So all of these people were not rabbis in the way that we think of rabbis, but in hindsight, we look at them as doing what we think of as a primary job of rabbis, of teaching Jewish tradition. And the picture that I put with this is actually a little bit different. I got it from the Chabad website, but it's a wonderful description of different books of rabbinic literature that were developed, that were written over time in different generations, and they show how the Jewish tradition was passed down through each generation, and it's recorded in each of these books. So in this view of the rabbis in Pirkei Avot, a rabbi is somebody who passes on, who learns from a past generation the Jewish tradition, however we want to define Jewish tradition, and then passes it on to the next generation. So the rabbis that, when we start to see rabbis in the form that we know about them, it's in the Mishnah and the Talmud. And we talk about ordination of rabbis, or in this case, ordination of elders. The rabbi, even if he, and it was definitely a he at this time, was viewed as the elder, as a senior, as a respected person in the community. So how did it take place? This is from the Talmud, from Tractate Sanhedrin, one of the tractates that deals with civil law and court law specifically. And It says, Abaye said to Rav Yosef, from where do we derive that the ordination of elders is performed by 3 judges? So they have a tradition that ordination, let's say it's laying of the hands, we'll call it that for now, or passing it on, appointing an elder, is done by 3 people, by 3 established judges. If we say that it is from the fact that it is written regarding Moses when he appointed Joshua and he laid his hands on him and he commanded him, if so, it should be enough for 1 man to ordain a new sage, as Moses ordained Joshua. So they're asking, they know, they have a tradition, wherever they got it from, that it takes 3 rabbis to ordain a new rabbi. But they want to know where it comes from. And their first thought is that it could come from Moses ordaining Joshua. And but then they reject that because Moses stood up there by himself and ordained Joshua. And ultimately they answer, the matter is difficult. There is no clear source for this halakha, for this law. So they don't know where the tradition of having 3 people ordain a new rabbi came from. Now, I think that's interesting. It's significant because on the one hand, they're passing on this tradition, which they say goes back to Moses at Sinai. On the other hand, they're also acknowledging that there are new things that have crept into the tradition, new parts of it that came apart in some other generation. They can't attribute the idea of 3 rabbis ordaining a new rabbi back to Moses because it's not in the story. But it's there anyway, and they say it's still our practice. So I get from this that the job of the rabbi in each generation is also to modify, to adapt, even to add to the traditions that are received, even if you can't trace that all the way back to Moses and Sinai. Then they continue this discussion. Rav Aha, son of Rava, said to Rav Ashi, do they ordain him literally with the hand? So he's asking, how do we ordain a rabbi? Do you actually place your hand on his head the way Moses did to Joshua? And Rav Ashi said to him, they ordain him by name by announcing it publicly. He is called rabbi, and they give him permission to adjudicate cases involving the laws of fines. So ultimately for them, rabbi, you become a rabbi by being recognized by the community. It's not literally passed on from a senior teacher. It is being accepted, it's being recognized by the community as a rabbi and given the right to, or the permission to, in this case, adjudicate the laws of fines. Now they ordain him by name, and he's called rabbi. So just a quick side note. I guess it was 2 weeks ago when I was here, and I was moving things into my office, and Rabbi Siegel was there, and he was looking at my ordination certificate from JTS, and it says on every rabbi's certificate, Chacham yitkare, v'rav, or v'rabi yitkare. He should be called a sage, he should be called a rabbi. And he told me this funny story that when he was at JTS, Professor Saul Lieberman, Rabbi Saul Lieberman, who was doing the ordinations, received a lot of flack from people more to the right wing in the Orthodox world for ordaining these rabbis, so to speak. And apparently Saul Lieberman made a joke. He says, it's not such a big deal. They call them rabbi or something like that. And he was blowing the guy off, but it was a funny take on what's actually a very serious part of our ordination certificates. So rabbis were passed on from one generation to another, and they were given this ability to lead. They were recognized by the community. But we also know that they were recognized as leaders in some way by people outside of the Jewish community as well, outside of the Jewish world. And it's always interesting to look at texts in the Talmud about how the Romans, the big power of the time, saw rabbis and how they interacted with them. And sometimes they're positive interactions, and sometimes they're very negative interactions. And this story that I'm going to share comes from after the time of the Bar Kokhba Revolt. 60, 70 years after the destruction of the temple, a man named Bar Kokhba leads a revolt against Rome that lasts for about 3 years before they finally end the revolt. And afterwards, the Romans realize they have a problem. They don't want the Jews still living in the land of Israel to rebel against them again. So they want to thoroughly crush their spirits. So this is what they do. At one time, the wicked kingdom of Rome issued decrees of religious persecution against the Jewish people, a common trope in Jewish history. And they said that anyone who ordains judges will be killed, and anyone who is ordained will be killed. And the city in which they ordain the judges will be destroyed, and the signs identifying the boundaries of the city in which they ordain judges will be uprooted. So they passed these extreme declarations, these extreme laws to prevent new rabbis from being ordained. So why do you think they do that? Why do you think the Romans go to such great lengths to stop ordination?
To stop the continuity.
Sorry, say that again?
To stop the continuity.
Okay, to stop the continuity. Okay. And what's the significance of stopping the continuity?
No leaders, everything falls apart.
Okay, so no leaders, everyone falls apart. You could say they're chopping off the head, and the body dies. Anything else?
No challenge, no protest.
Okay, no challenge, no challenge, no protest. So we know that the rabbis, particularly say Rabbi Akiva in Bar Kokhba's time, were inspirations for the rebellion. They supported Bar Kokhba, or some of them did, and they rallied people to his flag. So they were rising up against the Romans. Anything else? I can think of at least one more significant reason.
They hated show who's boss.
So what was that?
To show who's boss.
So part of it could be to show who's boss. I think to them, they recognized that it was the Jewish traditions that gave the Jewish people who were there some kind of inspiration, some kind of uplift in very dark times. And by wiping out the rabbis, they were trying to wipe out the continuation of Jewish tradition. And it was that very Jewish tradition, the idea of some kind of redemption, that was inspiring the Jewish people to rebel against Rome. They thought they could assimilate the Jews into the wider Roman Empire without their unique traditions that were keeping them separate, that were making Judea this troublesome region that kept starting wars against the mighty Roman Empire. Okay, so what do the rabbis do in this very dire circumstance? What did Rabbi Yehuda ben Bova do? He went and sat between two large mountains, between two large cities, between two Shabbat boundaries, between Usha and Shepharam. So he chose a place that was not connected to any city, so no one could be implicated in what he was going to do. And there he ordained 5 elders. They were Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Elazar ben Shamua. And then Rav Avia adds that Rabbi Nehemiah was also among those ordained, that ordained 6 more rabbis. They were the only rabbis left. Now, this story is probably not historically accurate. As many Talmudic stories are, it's based on history with a little bit of rabbinic fiction worked into it. When their enemies discovered them, Rabbi Yehuda ben Bova said to the newly ordained sages, "My sons, run for your lives." And they said to him, we can't leave you. But he was not able to run away. So he said to them, "I am cast before them like a stone that cannot be overturned." Then people say about this incident, the Roman soldiers did not move from there until they had inserted 300 iron spears into him, making him appear like a sieve pierced with many holes. So it has a very bloody, a very gory ending. Now, Rabbi Yehuda ben Bova, who we mentioned, this character was a historic figure. He probably was martyred by the Roman Empire. He's one of the rabbis who's commemorated in the Machzor on Yom Kippur in the martyrology section. Mm-hmm. Whether it happened exactly like this, as dramatically as it's described here, probably not. They probably didn't catch him doing a secret smicha ceremony. But it shows, it's again the rabbis of the Talmud showing how they carried on Jewish tradition even under the most terrible circumstances. They passed on the chain of tradition. Now we're going to skip many years because this is not the image of rabbis that we have today. And thank God, it's certainly not dangerous to be ordained as a rabbi or to study for the rabbinate. And instead of the rabbi learning from one master teacher and being ordained by that teacher. Some of you pointed out, rabbis most often study in seminaries, in institutions of higher education that are often denominationally based. Pointed out the conservative movement seminaries. We have the JTS, the Jewish Theological Seminary, the original one in New York, and the Ziegler School in California, and the Seminario in Buenos Aires, and Machon Schechter is a rabbinical school in Jerusalem that trains Israeli Masorti, Israeli conservative rabbis, and each denomination has its own, its own training schools. Additionally, now there are a number of non-denominational rabbinic schools that ordain rabbis to be in different, to be in different denominations. Boston's Hebrew College is one where some of their rabbis become conservative rabbis, become Reform rabbis. Some stay non-denominational. But you can be ordained in a number of different ways. In the Orthodox world, there are official seminaries like Yeshiva University or Chovevei Torah, but there are, or actually even in the Orthodox world, Yeshivat Maharat, which trains women as Orthodox spiritual leaders, whether they're called rabbi or not. But they still, in some parts of the Orthodox world, preserve private ordination, where one teacher passes on his knowledge to his students. Now, Rabbi Louis Jacobs, who was the founder of Masorti Judaism, of conservative Judaism in United Kingdom, began his life as an Orthodox rabbi, but was eventually expelled from Orthodox Judaism, just describes what happens today. Modern seminaries train their students in many disciplines other than that of pure Jewish law, so that ordination in these seminaries is a mailer of attesting to the proficiency of the graduates to carry out all the other functions of a modern rabbi, such as preaching, counseling, and pastoral work. And there's often a service of ordination and a celebration with pomp and ceremony, rather like a university graduation ceremony, from which, in fact, it seems to have been copied. And I brought a picture of an ordination ceremony at JTS. This wasn't mine. This was I think this was a year or two after mine. And obviously, as conservative Jews, we are egalitarian, where both men and women serve as rabbis and can ordain future rabbis. And this was very typical of what ordinations looked like at JTS in the old building. I haven't seen the new building yet. This is the same room where my ordination was. But as you can see, there is what we call a Beit Din, a court, which we preserve the number 3, which we learned about in the Talmud. 3 established rabbis are ordaining a new rabbi. And each person who's ordained at JTS has someone who comes up with him or her to bless them, to escort them to the Beit Din, and to give them a blessing after they are addressed as rabbi by the members of the Beit Din. So they would officially announce him as the rabbi, and she would give a blessing. So in my case, I stood before the Beit Din. Actually, of these 3, only Rabbi Nevins, who's the dean of the JTS Rabbinical School, was on my Beit Din. That's this guy over here. And my father, Cantor Wolk, who's with us today, was the one who escorted me up. And the imagery of it is that the communal leaders are acknowledging that you are qualified to teach Torah, you are qualified to teach Jewish tradition, and you're qualified to fulfill all of the jobs of the rabbi, all of the tasks of the rabbi that we read about from Rabbi Jacobs, such as preaching and counseling and pastoral work, which is so much a part of the rabbinic job today. So that's a very short history of rabbinic ordination, a very quick history of where we came from initially. Before I get to the second part, I'm going to stop the share for a second. Before I talk about myself a little bit and my influences, I want to open up to questions. Feel free to unmute yourself and shout in anything that you have. I see some people talking, but you're muted. Quiet group.
Do rabbis get formal training in psychology and counseling?
The rabbis get formal training in psychology and counseling. I would say in counseling, yes. And there's some psychology that is worked in with that. Some rabbis choose to do what's called CPE, clinical pastoral education, which really is a focus on counseling, and that can be used in a number of different settings, whether you're a pulpit rabbi or whether you're a chaplain. But that focuses more intensely on the chaplaincy part. But all rabbis, all seminaries today have some classes in counseling that all rabbis take.
But not a whole formal program, just a couple courses.
So there is, I would say, some do a whole formal program. Some take the full CPE accreditation, and some take part of it. But it's becoming, I'll tell you that it is becoming more important and more emphasized. So that CPE, the requirement that you do the program, only became required a few years ago. It is relatively new to the rabbinate. And we sometimes, I think that we base that model on the model of Christian clergy. I think it started in the Christian clergy world before it migrated into the Jewish clergy world.
Rabbi?
Yes, sir.
Apropos, how much comparative religion did you have to study?
How much comparative religion? I'm trying to think if in JTS, I don't think I did so much. When I was a student in Columbia University, I took a number of I took courses in Christianity and in Islam because I was interested in them. I know that there are courses that are offered together with, say, Union Theological Seminary across the street from JTS, and there is there's certainly interreligious dialogue that takes place with other seminaries. When you think of comparative religion, what specifically are you thinking about?
Well, no, I meant the study of other religions, Islam and Christianity and Baha'i.
There are usually opportunities to interact with clergy of other faiths more than formal classes. Any other questions?
What drove you to the rabbinate?
Well, okay, so it's a good segue into the next part of what I was going to talk about. Okay, so you're all getting to know me, and I'm getting to know you unfortunately, from a distance. So I wanted to share some of the things that that were shaping experiences for me. I'm going to share my screen again. I just put together a number of pictures that I have. And who knows the series of books on the left-hand side? Anyone familiar with those?
No, never.
It's called
before. The
Little Midrash Says. So I actually got to, someone says someone has them?
Yes.
So when I was in kindergarten, my parents bought me the first one, the book on Breshit. And I love to read, I still love to read, and I raced through it. And that was kind of my first experience with Torah study, with studying our sacred text and our tradition, because these books have the Torah stories and a lot of the rabbinic commentary on them, the legends that go with them, the way we often translate Midrash. So this was probably the first set of books that I read in entirety was the Little Midrash on the 5 books of the Torah. And I liked them not just because I liked the stories and because I felt like they were talking to the way, the traditions that I was learning at home and that I was practicing. But I should say also as a day school student, they gave me a great leg up in class. I was a bit of a know-it-all at that point. And those books were responsible for it. And the next
so when do you think that series could that series be introduced to younger children and then read again later? Because I have a granddaughter who's kind of like a little know-it-all also. But it sounds like it's something that she would really get into. But I don't know. Is it like
So
what age?
there's some great series out there. They're an excellent series. They could be read by little kids. There's actually an adult version of it called The Midrash Says. You know, this set of books is written from from an Orthodox publishing house, which is fine. They're still great books, but you kind of, you know, when you choose, at least for me, when I'm choosing children's books, I'm very cognizant of the bias that they come with, and the mindset that they have. So yeah, I would still recommend them, but there are also other good children's books out there. You know, there are, like, JPS has a number of good children's Torah books, but these books still are very good as well. And I'm a big fan of them. Now, as I mentioned a number of times, you know, my dad is a cantor. He's on here also. And, you know, both of my parents were very instrumental in teaching me about living a Jewish life. But my bar mitzvah was a very meaningful experience for me, because I spent about 2 years studying the Torah portion and leading services. I wasn't always the best musical student, but I certainly took it very seriously. But at the same time, being a know-it-all, I was also a very quiet kid. I didn't like standing up in front of people. Speaking in front of groups absolutely terrified me. Probably at that time, I would have liked the empty sanctuary better than I like it now. But having, you know, standing up for my bar mitzvah and leading services was really a big moment for me, because I stood up in front of a lot of people and was able to do something confidently. And not only was I able to do something confidently, I was able to present these areas of Jewish tradition that I had worked to master, that I had worked to learn. So I talk about my bar mitzvah as a very empowering experience, that I could take a tradition that was passed on to me and to share it with other people. And I started to realize that at my bar mitzvah, and it's something that's continued to be important, standing up on the bima, leading services, teaching. As a teenager, it was something that I continued to do. I like to go to minyan, and I like to be the one leading minyan, like to use those skills that I had learned. Now, I was also, as I mentioned, a day school student. And for middle school and high school, I was a student at the Hebrew Academy of Nassau County, or HANC. And HANC was an Orthodox, still is, an Orthodox yeshiva. And at HANC, I got an absolutely really incredible education in studying classic Jewish texts, in learning Gemara and Midrash, and being able to break them down, and a good knowledge of reading Hebrew, and understanding of the way the rabbis talk. I don't know if you can hear, that's Julia in the background who wants to participate. She says hi, or something like that. You know, but at the same time, the ethos of a classical yeshiva is a little bit different than the way that I want to teach. It was in some ways very cutthroat. It really favored the students in Judaic studies and study of Talmud who were at the very top levels, who could master absolutely everything. And the students beneath that, they weren't as expected to achieve quite as much, and they weren't given as much attention. And you know, as I've taught more students as a rabbi, I've kind of rejected that ethos that there are absolutely top students when it comes to studying Jewish tradition. And some of the best insights into, hold on, Julia just fell down, sorry. The pitfalls of teaching from home. And it was in teaching texts to students with very little Jewish background, I get some of the best insights from them. So that's something that I moved away from that particular model. They also at that school weren't particularly crazy about students who came from conservative synagogues. So that was part of my experience there. It was a harder part of my experience there. Now, after I graduated HANC, I was a student in college at Columbia University and at JTS, the Jewish Theological Seminary, which we've mentioned a few times. And so I spent 9 years in JTS, 4 as an undergraduate, 5 as a rabbinical student. And at JTS, they teach Torah study that's very different from the yeshiva. They teach it from an academic perspective, which means that every text has a history. It came from someplace. We actually don't believe that our texts were handed down to us at one particular moment, perfected from God. We know they developed over time. And that's a very different approach than yeshiva study, but it's an approach to Torah study that I find to be very valuable, knowing where our tradition came from and how it came to be. Now, while I was a student in college, I had the wonderful opportunity of spending the summer at the conservative yeshiva in Jerusalem, which if you're not familiar with it, is one of the hidden gems of the conservative movement. It's on Rehov Agron Street. It's part of the Fuchsberg Center. And you can go there, whether you're a high school student or a college student, or no matter how old you are, and study Torah in an egalitarian setting. And so the summer I spent there was really an eye-opening experience, because I was studying with contemporaries of mine, other people who had chosen to spend their vacation really back in school, back studying Torah, doing it by choice. And it was just the kind of experiences you have there. You spend all day in the Beit Midrash, in the study hall, arguing over classical texts. And then you go to downtown Jerusalem and you sit in one of the popular bars talking about what you've studied. And that's just an experience that's hard to duplicate anywhere else. I'm going to stop sharing the screen. So I think that for me, the decision to become a rabbi really happened over time. There wasn't an aha moment. It was something that developed based on the different influences I had in my life, the people I learned from, and the institutions that I learned from. But I'm really, my favorite part of being a rabbi is taking exactly back to what rabbis of old did, taking the traditions that I've been able to study in different locations and teaching them to new people, either people who have a lot of Jewish background. Sometimes I like an involved Talmud class, an involved Gemara class, where we study that text specifically just to learn that text. And sometimes to people with very little background. Working with conversion students has been a wonderful part of my rabbinic experience as well. And of course, everybody in between. So for me, sharing that tradition is a key part of being a rabbi. It goes hand in hand with all the other roles, like the preaching and the counseling that we spoke about before. So I'm going to open this up and let you guys ask me any questions. Shelley?
John?
Would you like your daughters to become rabbis?
Would I like my daughters to become rabbis? I think it's too early for me to say. I'm gonna hopefully let them figure out what they want to do, but I wouldn't say it's my dream at this point. My dream would be that they enjoy the lifestyle that we are living, and they enjoy practicing Jewish life in a similar way to the way that we do. And if that leads them to the rabbinate, good for them.
Rabbi, just a comment, not a question.
Sure.
Sadly, about 12 years ago, one of our beloved congregants, the Temple Israel, Roberta Monosoff, passed away. Her first cousins were rabbis James and Richard LeBeau.
I know Bill LeBeau much better than James. But
Williams.
Bill LeBeau is still at the Rabbinical Assembly, and
Right.
And he's an incredible teacher of rabbis, and he's someone who I've turned to for advice a number of times, even since I left school.
Good. And thank you. I said Richard. It is William. Thank you for the correction.
Sorry, didn't catch that. Joel?
Yes. What do you like to read for fun?
What do I like to read for fun? It's a number of different things. It depends what kind of mood I'm in. I would tell you, and I shared in my interview with Amy Udoff last week, right now, before I go to sleep at night, I'm reading a Star Wars novel. It's interesting that, and I like that because it's something light right before I go to sleep. When it comes to, I tend to like history books. I I actually right now I read a fair number of political books, which usually do not find their way into sermons, so don't worry about that. And you know, when it comes to Judaic books that I read, I think my habits have changed a little bit over time. And I was thinking about that as I was moving into my office, because at one point, rabbis would buy big sets of Gemara and all these traditional Sepharim, these traditional books. They look very impressive on your shelf. Problem is that you don't use them so much on a day-to-day basis, and a lot of it is available online. So those types of books I don't buy anymore. I like to buy different. I like to buy different sidurim. Liturgy is an area of mine, and how different people relate to the same prayers, and you know, the variety among them. So if there's a new siddur that comes out from pretty much any denomination, there's a good chance that I'm going to go out and start working my way through it. And often I'll take prayers from, you know, English prayers or even Hebrew prayers from different books, and incorporate them into services, you know, even if it's not in our particular siddur. It's kind of funny. There's a wonderful siddur, the Siddur V'ani Tfilati, which is the siddur of the Masorti movement in Israel. And in the back of it, there is a prayer for a driver, which if you've ever been in Israel, you know that you really need to pray when you drive. And I love that prayer. It talked about, you know, not giving in to your anger, things along those lines, which are serious problems when we drive. So it was just in Hebrew. I translated it once, and my parents are here, and there was someone in their congregation who taught, was it a defensive driving course? What was the course called?
It was the ARP defensive driving course.
The ARP defensive, the AARP defensive driving course. So it was a gift to him that we took a translation of it and we made it into a nice piece of art and presented it to him. So that's those are some of my reading habits, but they're all over the place.
I have a question. Oh, go ahead, Audrey.
No, go ahead.
Okay, so I have a question. It's kind of two parts. Who do you get a lot, or who has been most influential in terms of your inspiration for both religious and secular type issues? You know, who do you look to, or who has been your greatest influence in terms of how you think, or who you go to for resources in the modern, like in today's world, somebody that's alive?
Someone that's alive. I think that you know, there are, let's say, well, something we mentioned Bill Levo before. I've asked him questions as well. You know, I know that not in a formal teaching role, but more in a modeling role, I've learned an incredible amount from my father as a clergy person. You know, watching him over the course of many years, I've, you know, picked up certain things that you just learn informally. My grandfather was a rabbi, but I can't say that I knew so much about him as a rabbi. I didn't really see him work professionally. I think that, you know, when I look to people for advice, when I want to talk about you know, specific issues that are going on right now, I have a group of friends who I made both in college and in rabbinical school, and some afterwards also, who I think they're often similar enough to me that in religious mindset and practice, that we can have a conversation about the issue and you know, recognize the issue, recognize the questions that come up for each of us. So I think colleagues are probably more helpful than teachers in seminary, because teachers in seminary are in the ivory tower somewhat. So colleagues are very helpful in figuring out what to do, because we are all taking Judaism and applying it to people in the congregations that we serve.
Great, thank you.
Rabbi, I know that you've only been here, what, a week, 10 days?
Well, I've been, yesterday was my 1 week anniversary at Temple Israel.
Right. Have you had an opportunity to meet Asher yet at Bethel?
Meet Rabbi Knight?
Yes.
I have. So Rabbi Knight took me out for breakfast at Poppy's Bagels, not when I came here back in March. and we had a nice breakfast. He was the first person I met as part of the interview here, and he and I had a long Zoom conversation before he went away on vacation. So I've spoken to him a number of times, and I'm looking. He and I are very different as conservative and reform rabbis are, but looking forward to developing a working and personal relationship with him. In my last congregation in Louisville, working with other synagogues was something that was very important to me for the betterment of the individual synagogue and also for the wider community. And I think I spoke about that when I interviewed a lot. So I'm hoping that I'll be able to develop a similar relationship with Rabbi Knight where we trust each other.
Good, good. So you know that we have a lot of churches here in Charlotte.
I've noticed.
That's our major export.
One on every corner.
Only one.
It's
only
not
one
a
on
bank,
every
it's a church, right?
Only one on every corner. It's
sometimes there's two or three.
sometimes Louisville was very similar to that. It's funny because when I moved to Louisville from New York, I noticed that. I said there really are a lot of churches here. So Charlotte, it's not as big a shock, but they seem to be a little bit bigger here. I know we've passed some mega churches. There was one in Louisville. There was one called Southeast Christian, which was nicknamed Six Flags Over Jesus. But yeah, it will be interesting. I know interfaith work is very important to the community here. So I mean, I've heard about the very large interfaith Thanksgiving service that's held every year.
Mm-hmm.
And it's so interesting. Going back to your question before about influences, you can also learn a lot from clergy of other faiths because we have a lot in common, even if we practice totally different faiths.
Well, there are several in town who have a pretty nice relationship with Temple Israel as a whole.
I'm looking forward to meeting them and learning from them. It's like everything else, it's a little bit harder right now.
Yeah.
But it's I know it's an important part of the work here.
Yeah, Reverend Howell at United Methodist Ministers.
That's
I think
Julia,
that's
by the
the
way.
name.
Myers Park Methodist.
Myers Park United Methodist Ministers.
I think I saw a representative of one of our interfaith organizations here. Is that Ladane?
Yes. Hi. This has been great.
Yeah, we've met over email, but not in person yet.
Right.
Which we will have to figure out some way to do. And I can learn more about your organization.
Reverend Howell has been very, very friendly to Rabbi Ezrin here in Charlotte, and he has a PhD in the Old Testament, and Temple Israel and the Methodist Church went to Israel on a interfaith trip, I think in 2016.
That's really cool. That's great.
Yeah.
That's it's funny you say, there were two seminaries in Louisville. There was a Presbyterian seminary and a Southern Baptist seminary, neither of which had an incredible amount to do with the Jewish community. But we saw, seminarians from there sometimes. They would come to visit and learn about things. They always asked me for help with the Hebrew part. And then you talk to the Hebrew part of their curriculum, and then you talk to clergy ministers later on. You see the ones who are out there in the field more often, and they always comment, whenever they see a rabbi or a cantor, they always comment, oh, the Hebrew was the worst part of going to seminary, the hardest part of going to seminary.
2008 crisis, where companies were moving more toward technology.
Someone is watching the news. Marcy?
I'm one of those ecumenical Jews that goes to everybody. And I didn't grow up in a Jewish neighborhood, so I'm used to going to Christian churches. And I wanted to see what I think was evolution here is huge.
Elevation.
Elevation, yeah. I went to one of their meetings just to see what it was about. I was quite fascinated by it, but it was very interesting. When the service was over, I went to one of the people because they know exactly who a visitor is. I mean, and they're right there with you.
Mm-hmm.
And I asked her, well, how do you manifest what you learn? And I got the most blank looks. I just could not believe she didn't understand what I was saying. And so I tried to elaborate. I said, you learn a lot of messages and you're learning from your minister and you're going to Bible school. How do you manifest what you learn? And they didn't understand what I was trying to say. And I thought that was such a crucial difference in Christianity and Judaism, is that we are to learn, but we manifest what we learn through mitzvot, I think. And I don't know, I was quite flabbergasted about that. That was very, very interesting to me.
It's interesting because we're such an action-based religion. You used the word mitzvot. You know, for Jews, we probably think about actions more than we think about believing. And it's a gross.
But the actions are how you manifest your belief, is it not?
Yeah, and that's what that's interesting. That's what think about the first line of the Shema, when we're told you should love the Lord your God. So some of the commentaries ask, how do you show love to God? It's through the way you act. So that's an important part of Jewish tradition. And I don't know different Christian denominations how they would approach a question like that. But it's very much a Jewish idea, is that we express our love or our commitment through what we do. So I haven't thought about using the term manifest before, but that makes sense as well. So I know that
Rabbi,
Bunny, looks like Bunny, you're waving.
Yeah. Do you know at this point, are there any plans to either reopen the synagogue or to meet in smaller groups in order to have more of a hands-on approach to temple life during this COVID-19 issue, or plans for the holidays? What's going to happen?
I will say that you will be seeing a message from the synagogue about the holidays before Shabbat, about the high holidays.
Before Shabbat this week, or?
Before Shabbat this week.
Okay, that's pretty soon.
Like
Go ahead.
It is pretty soon. It is pretty soon. I would say that, unfortunately, we do not have imminent plans to reopen. It seems like North Carolina is going in the wrong direction case-wise. And I think that we need to continue to have the mindset of we need to take care of ourselves and take care of the other people around us. Opening the synagogue is very risky because we don't want to be responsible for passing on the virus to anybody else. I think that the longer this goes on, then we will have to find more ways to do hands-on activities outside, outdoors, distance things, that we just have to, because we can't continue exclusively like this. But at this point, I think it's going to be a constant monitoring of what the situation is out in the wider world. When it comes to reopening, we don't really have the ability to plan so far in ahead. So I wish I could give a more optimistic message on that one. But
Rabbi, my grandson is modern Orthodox, and he lives in Washington Heights, New York.
Mm-hmm.
He has the synagogue he belongs to is having outside daily minyan.
Just what I was saying.
And there's a bunch of parks up in Washington Heights, so they're in the park. And Shabbat, the sanctuary holds about 100 people. They're having 2 services with a maximum of 25 each. At each service, 7:30 in the morning and at 9 o'clock in the morning, and you have to sign up. You just can't walk in. And for Aliyahs, one person takes out the Torah, he reads from the Torah, he gets all 7 Aliyahs, and he puts the Torah back. So that's how they're
coping it. Yeah. I would say I've heard of a number of synagogues in New York that are doing that, including the ones that I'm familiar with. New York was the epicenter of this pandemic for so long, and they went through absolute hell, and they're doing better than a lot of other parts of the country are right now, and they feel a little bit more confident being there than possibly than we do here. I say that we will look into outdoor services, but I don't think that this week or next week is the time to be doing it. I think that I would like to see some positive development before I give the message that we're heading towards a reopening. Cantor?
When we go back to live weekday minions, I would suggest that we continue to Zoom the minions also.
Oh yes, definitely. I think for as long as we can possibly see, we will be continuing the online part of it. And I think there will even be a time, let's say we count a minion as a hybrid between between people present and people on a minion, because it's going people will have different levels of comfort, different times when they are medical wise able to return to in-person services. So the online is not going anywhere.
Okay, that's good.
Cantor, Rushbarg?
Yeah. I will reference back to Marcy's her visit to Elevation Church, and I went there just as an observer 8 or 10 years ago, and there was one thing that I thought I wish we could incorporate that they do. It bother Rabbi Ezring and me no end that on a Friday night, not so much on a Saturday morning, we would have isolated islands. There were 10 people sitting over here and 12 people over here and 5 over here. At Elevation Church, there is an usher who leads you to your seat. No empty seats allowed. They fill up row number 1, then row number 2, because they acknowledge that in order to have a real worshipful experience, you have to be shoulder to shoulder with your fellow worshipers. And I don't know that we could get away with doing that, but I envy them that they did that.
I think by your description, it's very clear that you are not dealing with Jews there.
For sure.
They were. I don't know any synagogue where that would work, but in Louisville, we were blessed with a huge synagogue. Without any extra seats, we sat 600. I don't know what Israel sits yet, so it was pretty big, but certainly bigger than we needed on Shabbat morning. And I was very much a tinkerer with the seats. It drove people crazy because I tried to come up with different ways of getting people to move together. So I know what you're talking about. But one of the things I like about the Temple Israel sanctuary, although you would be much more familiar with it than I am at this point, is that it's so big, but it does feel closer together. The way it's angled and the way it's set up, it still manages to have an intimacy to it, despite how grand it is.
Yeah, the only method that we tried was groveling, and it didn't work.
I just find it interesting that we're supposed to be social distancing, except on Friday night where we don't know how to social distance.
What do you mean?
Or the other way around, we do social distance. Nobody wants to sit together.
Well, the way we sit on Saturday, we invented social distancing.
Yeah.
That's true.
Oh, I don't know.
Like, Bob? Go ahead,
Yes.
Bob.
One option for outdoor service would be the basketball court at Camp Mindy on the J grounds, because the roof is a permanent structure.
The basketball camp at Camp Mindy, I've
The,
seen that.
the pavilion area.
The pavilion area.
They're also doing outdoor exercise classes.
I've seen it. Was very funny to walk past the driving garage and hear a class going on in the parking garage.
Yeah.
That was I was kind of amused by that, but yeah, I think we're gonna have to get creative with space.
Yeah.
It's and looking for good outdoor space. And obviously, we're still in the middle of building an outdoor sanctuary. It's still that was very visionary of Temple Israel to start building it before this started. If once it's completed, it will have plenty of uses.
No fun.
So I know Ariel wanted to share an announcement. Ariel DiDonato is with us.
Hi, everyone. I love seeing everyone's face. Thank you to Rabbi Wolk for your very engaging first lunch and learn. I know you have many more classes coming up, but speaking about in a sort of way of coming back together, I just wanted to make sure everyone was aware that this Sunday at 4 o'clock, we are actually going to be doing a welcome carpool parade for Rabbi Wolk and his family. So we would love it for everyone to come, make a sign or just come to honk and wave. His whole family will be out there, his kids, and it's just a really great, unfortunately, you won't have the opportunity to park and get out of your car, but just spreading the love of welcoming them officially to our community, at least in person. So please join us this Sunday at 4.
Which entrance, please?
Oh, yes, I'm sorry. So please enter, really great point, Bob, thank you. Please enter through the Shalom Park main entrance, and then you will come around through the long driveway of the temple, and then Rabbi Wolk and his family will be there to wave and greet, and then you will exit out the temple's back entrance. So we won't have to worry about people, turning around to exit the same direction.
Unfortunately, I will not be there to honk my horn. The Women's League for Conservative Judaism is having their triennial convention, and at 4 o'clock, 3:30, 4 o'clock is the awards time, and our sisterhood is getting an award. So we all have to be on Zoom to watch that. So if we don't honk our horns, Bunny and I and a few others, you'll forgive us, Rabbi. We'll come by and honk another time.
We'll honk another time.
Drive by my house and start honking. That can never, nothing can go wrong, right?
Okay, we can do that.
Especially the baby's sleeping. I want to thank you all for coming today and for learning and for chatting. And we're going to have more opportunities to do this. I'm actually going to see to get an outside tour of the Hebrew cemetery. So I learned more about that Charlotte Jewish institution. So I look forward to seeing all of you some way in the near future.
Thank you so much. It was a great start.
Thank you, everybody.
Great.
Yes,
Thank you very much.
Say hello to my family.